Hello everybody, it's Space King Scott, and this is the first episode of my Xeno series analysis videos that I plan to produce. The first episode will cover the new lore that has been inducted into the Xeno canon by ways of the Xenoblade 3 Aionios Moments art book. This information is provided by Xeno Mira, who I will link in the description. The provided translations are largely clear and have illuminated much of what's going on. I know this video will be a bit late compared to other Xeno series YouTube channels, and my apologies on that front. I have unfortunately been dealing with major life problems for the last week or so. Despite the fact that I was there when the art book leaked and when we first started getting the lore, I was there hours afterwards using terrible machine translation to look at the script with my friends in a Discord call. It was wild. Anyways, this video will be composed of minimal editing, and as such, I recommend you watch it in a sort of podcast style. This is because I simply cannot comfortably edit this video to be comprehensive. This video script is currently at 9,700 words, and yeah, I'm writing the opening last. Anyways, as for the format, we'll be introducing each quote that was provided in the art book, and then we will go ahead and start giving input. This input will come in many different forms, such as narrative analysis, theories, my general reactions, so on and so forth. I basically just wrote what came to mind as it pertained to each segment. Also, I have deliberately gone out of my way to avoid watching the videos produced by other Xeno content creators on this new information. That is so that I can make it so that my reactions are my own and solely my own. I don't want to risk the possibility of any sort of cross-contamination. That's not to say that I don't like other Xeno content creators. I do like a lot of them. And I will be watching their videos after this goes up. If all goes according to plan, this should probably be up maybe the 6th at the latest, though that does assume that all goes according to plan, and once again, life has not been kind to me as of late. Also, I want to clarify that this video is being recorded on the 3rd, so any further additions and translations after this point obviously cannot go into the video. I'm sorry for that, but I cannot see the future. Your boy isn't freaking Shulk, IRL. It's just not feasible, okay? So we will aim for the best with what we can do. Anyways, without further delay, let us get into this. Alright, first quote. Takahashi thanks his staff for working on the game working remotely, implying at least some of the work on Xenoblade 3 was done from home during the pandemic. First comments. This makes the achievements of 3, to me, like, even more impressive, honestly. Remote work was a difficult adjustment for a large portion of people in the video games industry, and it saw productivity go down in a lot of cases, such as Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. I hope that Monolith Soft has sorted out the development environment sufficiently for its future projects. I also wonder if Future Redeemed was developed remotely. If it was, then that is damn impressive, honestly, considering I consider that game to be their best work. We know that a very large swath of Xenoblade 3 was outsourced to other studios. That was the same as Xenoblade 2. I'm left wondering how much of the game was done while they were pre-COVID to how much was post, and how COVID impacted the overall production timeline. Like, was the game supposed to come out a year earlier or something along those lines? That would have been interesting to see. Alright, now for the first actual quote on the lore. Getting into this, regarding the Black Fog, here is Takahashi's quote. Looking at the survey, the first thing that can be answered, I believe, is regarding the Black Fog. Basically, it's a sign that the worlds of 1 and 2 are approaching each other. Those signs are appearing in another world, the opposite world. For example, in Xenoblade Definitive Edition, the fog appeared on Shulk's side. Looking at it from a different perspective, a similar phenomenon was occurring on Rex's side. Just that it wasn't portrayed. In Xenoblade 2, I believe there was a monster called the Infernal Goldo. As the worlds approach each other, a Goldo that was in the land of Moritha from 2 is being projected to the opposite world. That's the kind of phenomena occurring. The Black Fog monsters, that's what that's all about. To put it simply, the two worlds have attached together partially, and the effect is that a phenomena which you see, the materialization of particles as a black fog. and when that is heightened, annihilation occurs. Quite a few of my staff might actually not know about this either, he laughs. And by the way, the woman on the ID card that the Goldo drops in Xenoblade 2 is just from an ordinary woman. It's not Galea. Alright, getting into my responses here. Most of this was actually pretty easy for me and a lot of people to put together ahead of time, I think. Some parts were a bit out there, like, for example, that the Goldo was actually a sort of projection into that world of Xenoblade 1. I had, for the longest time, just thought that it had physically crossed over by some sort of means, though I guess this actually does make a degree of more sense. This also makes, to me, Shulk's Monado replica Rex even more interesting from a technological perspective. I actually wonder if the technology that it engineered to fight the Black Fog served as any sort of basis for any of the many projects that were ultimately connected to Origin. It shows that Shulk was a truly brilliant mind, and that he was particularly well suited to understand and fight off the incoming disaster. Also, I'm a bit disappointed that the Goldo that we face in 2 isn't Galea's human form that was corrupted. Honestly, it's just kind of, lined up perfectly, right? Old Klaus died because his counterpart Zanza in the other dimension died at the same time. And if we line up the timelines of Xenoblade 1 and 2 to existing at the same approximate time, which we're led to believe, then the fight with Goldo in Old Torna's ruins lined up pretty decently with Menath's death in the world of Xenoblade 1. I had, for the longest time, thought this enhanced the connection between the two games, but I just guessed that it wasn't meant to be, huh? I think that Allrest dealing with a fog-related crisis of its own is actually very interesting. It means that we have room for potentially more storytelling in the world of 2 prior to the intersection. An idea that I actually floated in Discord is that perhaps in 2027, for the then 10th anniversary of Xenoblade 2, we could get a Xenoblade 2 Definitive Edition, and that might include a mini-campaign that would be set after 2's main story, which could include stuff connecting to Xenoblade 3 and depict their own fog-related struggles. And maybe this is also a selfish request of mine, but I'd love it if they used that sort of adventure as an opportunity to square away Rex's relationship with Mia and how that ties in with the other girls as well, too. Just an idea. Alright, on to the next part. Regarding if Lands is a machina, Takahashi responds, so the question is whether or not Lands is a machina. Yes, he is one. And the quote gets cut off. Now, the immediate response of a lot of people to this question might be like, why is this a question? Well, for your information, I was actually part of a small project to get questions submitted to the questionnaire from English fans. And this is one of the ones that we actually got submitted, so this might be actually my fault. You most likely are able to square this away as it's sort of self-evident, but this ties into the 2 realms of thought that have developed surrounding Xenoblade 3. There are 2 camps, I feel. The literalist interpretation and the thematic interpretation. Literalists maintain that the answers that we were provided in the story and their mysteries, many of which are verified as what the community has put together, wasn't explicitly stated, therefore it could not be considered a hard fact. This extended to, also notably, on the wiki. You and I are able to decipher that the fact that the party of Xenoblade 3 is made up of the various races of Xenoblade 1 and 2, but people producing these pages stuck to what the games had declared. Thus the term Agni Inhuman and Convesi Human gained a little bit of traction to explain this. The art book explained that Machina in 3 actually took a bit of a different form from how they did in 1 on account of the fact that they are divorced from the culture and context of their world and lives in Xenoblade 1. And there are very, very few people in Xenoblade 3 remaining who can inform the party of this context, which ultimately would have proven to be a narrative waste of time. That's at least what I was able to gather from the terrible machine translation that I got put together. And this is an important victory, in my opinion, for the thematic interpretation of Xenoblade 3, because many took the path of reading in between the lines and trying to solve the many mysteries of Aionios. Several of those mysteries may be dubbed to be self-evident, but it shows that the game was designed with a certain core intention narratively. The reason that Xenoblade 3's picture of the lore is fuzzy is because of the passage of time erasing the clarity of those prior events. Things and ideas that were once understood in one kind of way are now understood in another, and this extended to the very terminology that was used to describe people. Those seeking out thematic interpretations of the game understood that fact, and as such were able to prematurely unwind many of the mysteries that the art book ultimately solved for us definitively. And this is a fact that's going to become clearer and clearer as we go along. Alright, now getting into our first major lore drop. Or, no, actually not. Takahashi says this about survey. Regarding most questions that were written into this survey, almost all of them have proper answers. However, I'm not just answering them now, since I don't think it's necessary at this point. So, for those sorts of things, well, if Monolith Soft is fortunate enough to continue creating things in the future, then I think we will be able to answer it at a certain point. For example, I understand that there are many requests to see what happens after the ending. And if we were to do that, we would have to make what lies further beyond from Xenoblade 3. So, I understand the sentiment, but please hold for a bit. If you can look forward to it and wait, that would be appreciated. Alright, so here's my take. I'm currently writing this as I actually listen to Future Awaits, which honestly has become a "You Will Now Cry on Command" song for me. Future Redeemed really hit different, man. A once-in-a-lifetime moment for me as a fan. What was clear at the end of that adventure, though, was that although the story of Klaus's experiment was now over, that there was still new and insane stories left to be told. Stories that were now wholly freed from the confines of the original outline for the story in the Perfect Works timeline of Gears. I always felt that there were mysteries left there on purpose to be expanded on the future, and this just confirms that. Some of those mysteries, some of these ideas, they aren't left out of negligence, they're left out because they're to be expanded on in future stories. And I think that the backlash to Xenoblade 3 in some respects is a result of mismanaged expectations. Nintendo has historically been terrible at presenting the Xenoblade franchise in a form that makes sense. If you go today to the store page for Twin of the Golden Country, you'll find an article that describes that Malice is the wielder of the legendary Monado, and this is used as advertising material. While this is true, it falls in line with a potentially false and literalist interpretation of the game as being directly connected to one, and that the swords were somehow the same. History repeats itself, with Nintendo talking about how this was the finale of the Cloud Saga, and promising an end to the story. They failed, in my mind, to properly convey that while we were done with the storyline of the experiment, that didn't mean that we were done with the entire story of Xenoblade. Much like how many walked away from Kingdom Hearts 3 disappointed that it didn't resolve every single tiny thread in the story of the series because it was never intended to be a grand finale. And I think that the same fate may have hit Xenoblade 3, albeit to a much lesser extent. Nintendo will do well to properly manage expectations as we go into the future. I also do think that this all but confirms that Xenoblade 4 has at least some sort of level of production or planning. If Xenoblade 3 were made under the assumption that it was the final title, then remaining threads wouldn't have been allowed to dangle in such a fashion. Prior to the game's release, they stated that they wanted the series to go on for as long as possible, and given that the sales were solid and the reviews are glowing, I do think that our future has been secured and we will be moving on to a new saga. Old elements will reappear and dangling threads will be addressed, and that's just the nature of sequels. Another consideration is that we've transitioned from sitting in a series that is composed of open and shut series into a series that has an overarching storyline and that will continue episode over episode. Xenoblade 1 is the most standalone entry in the saga, and that's because it was never really envisioned as the starting point of something tremendous. It ultimately became that, however, due to the success that it experienced, whereas the prior projects that they had made had failed. Xenoblade 2 opened the closed book that Xenoblade 1 left behind, and Future Connected then was a step forward yet, which left us deliberately halfway. Future Connected itself was heavily criticized for that half step, but that's the exact moment when it ought to have been made left clear. Xenoblade 3 then is the culmination of this transition. We are now fully in a serialized storyline that will continue entry over entry. Future Redeemed then serving as the end of the initial storyline that began with the experiment, by means of ending said experiment. However, deliberately dangling threads to then follow up on. And this is another example of mismanaged expectations. We were previously led to expect open and shut books, but along the way we stopped shutting the book, and we never took a moment as a community to acknowledge that this had taken place. This is a failure both on us, as well as Nintendo and Microsoft, for not being clear with us what to expect going forward, unfortunately. On to the next comment. Regarding the admin of Origin, regarding the world of Aionios, or rather the way Origin works, there's a proper reason for it. In actuality, there's this and that reason, and that's why this world is constructed as such. That kind of thing. Now that, I can't say yet. Now it would not be the timing for that. So for now, it's fine to think of it as basically a virtual world. That wouldn't be wrong, to put it simply. The administrator of that world could do anything, and in the main story of Xenoblade 3, that was Z. That's the story, yes. Before we get into the potential bombshell that this statement represents, we first need to acknowledge that the translations are both early and also potentially imperfect. Several mutuals that I've spoken to are in disagreement on the wording and phrasing of the term here. This will remain to be seen how it pans out in the future. With that having been said, though, speculation, interpretation, and theories based off of this information are obviously massively subject to change. I appreciate that Takahashi is forward by stating that some of these mysteries are being saved for the future. Considering that Future Redeemed ends on the notion of the reunification of Earth, it's suffice to say that the functionality of Origin, nature of Aionios, and those sorts of things will prove to be lore important going into the future. Again, end of the saga, not end of the story and all of its mysteries. It's good to see them state now that so that we have a better expectation of what's coming later. Now, on the notion of Aionios being a false or digital place, that's actually clarifying a lot of things. In the finale of Xenoblade 3, after Mobius' destruction, we actually see what appears to be the two worlds drifting back together, and that's from the perspective of Aionios. This then means that Aionios is not literally the remains of Xenoblade 1 and 2's worlds, but rather data that is based on the two merged together. A good point of comparison would be to say that it's something like Xenosaga's UMN, a sort of separate plane that exists in parallel to regular reality. That shares much in common with baseline reality, but isn't actually itself the original world. This would also serve as to explain just what it is that we witnessed in the beginning and end of the game. Child Noah looks up at the sky, time stops, Aionios in its entirety happens within a single moment of time, and then time snaps back into place. The intersection, which would have initially been thought of as serving as a precursor to the end of reality, is instead the promised reunion of Earth. The worlds were never vaporized, as was initially hypothesized by the world's greatest minds. This interpretation also completely discredits the bad faith interpretation of the ending of Xenoblade 3 that it has somehow retconned itself out of existence. Noah is seen to clearly remember at least some of what has occurred. I don't think it's a stretch to infer that people reclaiming their memories of their lives in Aionios being a plot point 4 is off the table. Aionios may have been a false world in a matter of speaking, but it still happened. It still mattered. And it was likely necessary in order for the intersection to not entail the end of the world, but rather its rebirth. Moving on to the next comment. For the villains of Xenoblade 3, Takahashi says, and the quote skips over some parts, I wanted to change a bit of how the villains were portrayed. For example, in Xenoblade and Xenoblade 2, the villains had their own pride, or their own principles. It could be a philosophy, or even faith, but the villains had their own sense of justice. But for Xenoblade 3, I had a bit of, what if I brought it closer to reality? In terms of what is reality. Let's say, for example, those in positions of power. Now, saying people in positions of power are villains is, well, a bit dangerous of a way to put it, but let's just say that as an example, in real-life society, they are the system, as Z says. They can decide on a system and they can run it. Even for those people in positions of power, I'm sure they have a life story, social ties and such. But what we can see at the surface, what we can feel is their roots, and most of that is, how should I say this, a desire for control, for money, for fame, maybe very rarely lust. That's where it tends to be rooted in, and occasionally some unsavory people show themselves. What if those people were the villains? So the villains this time around are the Mobius, and for them, I wanted to make them villains you couldn't sympathize with, by exaggerating the unsavoriness and patheticness that real-life humans have. Towards the end of the story, I believe there's a scene where Z says, "It's because it amuses me." But that line could be, "It's because 3-star restaurants taste delectable," or "It's because I love to make money." The line can be whatever. We place the Mobius in that position as a representation of that unsavory aspect of reality. My input for this is basically that this is a victory lap for me. I was right. At the very smooth-brained takes I've seen over the past were wrong. Mobius are shallow, and that shallowness is not a defect, but a feature. Much like how capitalist pigs in our own world would have us die for the line, willingly fund genocides, suppress information, oppress smaller groups, and sow discord in our real world, Mobius effectively embodies that ugliness of humanity. Z is one shallow and pathetic piece of shit. But when I think of what a person is like, for example, Elon Musk, and what they must be like in the day-to-day life and interactions, I can't really say that I imagine much different. The exceptions are N, M, J, C, and S, and them aside though, generally, the rest of Mobius are completely out of touch with reality. Ultra-selfish, nihilistic, murderous to an extreme degree, as well as just generally being cartoonishly unsympathetic goons. That's not a bug, it's a feature. You are fighting the concept of people being out of touch with the common man itself. You are fighting the concept of extreme selfishness incarnate. You are fighting the very fundamental idea of an unwillingness to face the future, to linger in the present. You are facing the very concept of the old governing the youth and failing to relinquish the right to rule, to lead, and to grow. And from those perspectives, Mobius excel. I get the idea of wishing that they were more fleshed out characters individually, but I do think that the members that I mentioned above are generally enough to buck the trend and also introduce a degree of balance. I mean, N's not the GOAT for no reason, right? Tetsuya Takahashi stated before the release of the game that he hoped that young people would play and enjoy 3, and now taken with this input, I don't think it's possible to divorce Xenoblade 3 from the obviously very overtly political interpretation that it was obviously meant to be. The quiet part has basically been said out loud at this point. Now, moving on. Commenting on End's sword. What's inside of the sword of the End that End's holds? That would be Logos. I mean, it's Malos, but Malos, for the time being, is dead, or has disappeared. As to why Malos is there, I'm sorry about this, but I can't answer that at this point. But what N is holding there, that is Malos himself. Victory for me again. Mind you, I didn't expect a hard confirmation, either now, ever, or even in the next game. I thought this was something that was just never going to be addressed. Even though I chose to believe, it's a rewarding revelation indeed. Malos fans have basically won by doing nothing. People have made this observation to death, but it's supremely interesting that Malos has ended up paired with a would-be driver that differs from him in basically every single possible respect philosophically. Malos and Aionios would have been an epic fever dream, a place that he'd have been able to tear down and destroy in glee. But this time, as a place that ostensibly must be destroyed, whereas N has become a preserver, and that being of stagnancy. I'd love it if we were able to somehow receive his input and his perspective from during his era, how he would grow to resent N, but he would be powerless to do anything to resist. Sounds peak fiction to me. As for what all this means, well, it's very obvious that this will be relevant to Xenoblade Chronicles 4. But I think that the reason he cannot explain that is origin metal. its own origin, its own story, its history, and the specifics of its functionality, that's all going to be critical to future events. I also think that this is not a case where the physical Logos core is in the sword. It's most likely, at least in my interpretation, the sword that is forged from the memories and history that make up the idea and concept of Malos, rather than being physically composed of his core crystal, as we saw it destroyed in Xenoblade 2. And I think that this then could be used as a means to possibly facilitate his revival in the next title. And another interesting part of this to now analyze. This recontextualizes the final battle of Future Redeemed as being a reunion between the component members of the Trinity. Ontos is present in the form of Alvis. Numa is present in the form of the Fists of the End. And Logos is present in the form of the Sword of the End. This means that this final battle that takes place here and now at the end of Future Redeemed is the final conflict between the siblings of the Trinity processor. And it just makes it peak, in my opinion. It's ridiculously interesting. Okay. Moving on. Regarding Lucky 7, and Lucky 7, which Noah came to wield. This is actually, this is not mentioned within the story, but Fiora is inside of it. In regards to the above statement about Lucky 7, nobody that was present for the interview seemed to be aware of this information, and this statement caused a bit of a stir, with all of them simply responding with the response, Fiora? Wow, just, wow, right? Like, that's almost unbelievable. For some context from what I expected, I was in the Discord VC with my friends, using garbage Google Translate picture app to try and sort out what was being said by zooming far in on low-quality leaked images. It was infuriating, trust me. And when I did so, I basically lost it at the Malos thing. But this is when I started recording my reactions, because I knew from this point on that we were entering absolutely wild-ass territory. What an absolutely insane and unexpected twist. The guys over at the Vector Translations Discord were able to find a flaw in Xenoblade 3 Future Redeemed's localization. We were previously led to believe that Lucky 7 was composed of multiple souls of people important to Melia, and this is unfortunately a flaw of the translation. It's supposed to imply just a single individual, and we now know who that person is. After having stewed on this, I think it makes a lot of sense that Lucky 7 is effectively a Monado with Monado arts. After all, Fiora was effectively a vessel, I suppose, maybe an avatar, for Mayneth. And Mayneth was undoubtedly extremely important to the lore and cosmology of the Xenoblade multiverse, given that she was a god and she did wield her own Monado. So, it would then follow suit that Fiora remains extremely important. People that are saying that this is just a way of shoehorning Fiora into being important, no, you just didn't pay attention, man. Fiora was always an extremely important character, and she was always more than just her crush on Shulk. She was the vessel for Mayneth, and that was an important part of her characterization. So much so that, like, side media, for example, Project Cross Zone 2, doesn't really spend a lot of time talking about her connection to Shulk so much as it is spending time talking about her connection with Mayneth. That's just an example, though. Next quote, elaborating on it, he states, while some people like Shulk and Rex appear in the world in the flesh, some people appear as an object, and that is the expression or reflection of their traits or thoughts. Things like, how can I change the world? I think this is the best way to do it. Think of it as something as like that. Honestly, this is kind of hard to parse. So it seems to be a case-by-case situation then, right? And people that manifested outside of the flow then must be logically free from the flow and therefore eternal, like Mobius. So the picture of who is physically there and who is stored in data is honestly uncertain. This is one of those things where I wish that we got more clarification. Next comment, Kojima asks Takahashi, Noah threw it. Lucky 7, into the ocean at the end of the game. Was that okay? And Takahashi responds as follows. This conversation, how do I put this? It deals with the fundamental aspects of Origin and Aionios. You can think of it broadly as a virtual world. Think of it like a server in a virtual world. It actually isn't the case, but this will be fine for demonstration purposes, and he laughs. And within that, there's some source code that's running. And as a way to express that, it can take the form of a sword, but also not, and Alvis was responsible for the general management of Origin systems. As the administrator, Alvis was quietly watching for a while. After Origin started up, as this was happening, Z, a partial administrator and collective conscious-like entity, started doing things on its own. The story of Future Redeemed starts when Alvis deems this unacceptable. First and foremost, he's dodging the question on Noah, Lamau. But it's alright. With reality resetting, it means that Fiora and Numa are fine, I suppose. So, no, Noah is not on the fraud watch. Stating out loud that Z is part of the collective unconsciousness, this was something that we were able to parse pretty easily ahead of the confirmation, but it's good that has been resolved. Continuing, he states, many things happen after that, but Alvis, who he's talking about specifically is not named, but I assume Alvis, or more specifically A, ends up siding with Shulk & Co., so there was no longer a general admin, and so Z replaced that position, and that's why Z can mess with the source code, making the human lifespan 10 years and observing it because it's amusing, and things like that. Although the whole 10-year lifespan thing was a change made to the code prior to Future Redeemed. Basically, you can do a lot of things. He can be brazen about it. When thinking about what can be done to break that source code, this is where you get to the use of external powers. I believe this was stated in the story, but a kind of power that exists outside of the flow will be necessary. In regards to what that power would be, it can be the power of the will of young people living in the world. And regardless of Numa or Logos, it's the same kind of entity as Alvis, and thus an external factor from Z's point of view. Therefore, combining these powers and retaking the world for ourselves, that would be the broad explanation of Origin-related things. The first part of this is interesting. It feeds into the speculation and interpretations of the Xenoblade cosmology and how X, Y, and Z are effectively a Trinity processor emulator. This also runs counter to our assumption that A, Shulk, and Rex fully ascended the position of administrator at the end of Future Redeemed. Shulk did deny the position of godhood, so perhaps they were forced into a role of a passive observation, while the would-be god runs rampant. It's good that we for certain have an answer on the source code of the lifespan thing. That was a change prior to Future Redeemed, as we understand it. So this does suggest that Mobius' earliest actions were to establish their dominion and rule. Then Autos woke up and intervened, and then Future Redeemed plays out. It's good that Takahashi is addressing the elements of existing outside of the flow. This is basically what I've been saying for a while, but Aionios is a world which is governed by emotion. It is the emotion of fear that dictated Mobius' wish. It is the emotion of despair that kept Noah and Mio coming back over and over and over again. It was the emotion of regret that served as End's power, and it was probably love that caused Shulk and Rex to appear in the world for the sake of their children. Next comment. Since there is a great interest in it, I will also translate what follows the quote above. You had to collect Origin Shards at the end of the main story, right? There's nothing concretely decided in terms of who is what shard, but you never know. Maybe those shards could be rhyme and broad strokes. If you think about it this way, it wouldn't be wrong. I doubt that Takahashi thought of this sort of thing until this very exact moment. That would be funny though if that was the case, right? I wonder if some people are going to rush and try and say, well, this person must be stored in this shard, or something like that. That would also be entertaining. Update, I'm adding this to the script later. You already saw some of that. People speculating that Dromark manifested as the Cloud Keep. I don't think so, fam. He adds to this saying, to put it bluntly, Alvis, who was the one person that was the core processor, as well as the possessor of the Monado, Shulk, and similarly the possessor, no, partner of the same processor, Rex. These three sustain the world, and the main characters outside of those are lending their strength to the characters in Aionios. That's the structure. So, when Noah throws Lucky 7 into the ocean at the end, he was like this. He was pondering like this before throwing it. That was like saying thanks to the sword. Thanks for everything. That kind of thing. Something like, the battle is over, and a new world is starting. Thank you. And thus it's liberated. Return to the world. It was returned. Returned to origin. I'm assuming that he is referring to A as Alvis in this connotation, which is an important distinction. It also runs with my interpretation of Shulk standing in for Logos and Rex standing in for Pneuma in a new trinity, which is thematically beautiful. After everything that Shulk and Rex had individually gone through to protect their worlds, they effectively became worthy of the divine title of an Aegis. Aegis being Greek, meaning the shield of God, just as they, too, had shielded their worlds, their people, their friends, their family, from harm countless times. With this actual answer, Noah is definitively off the fraud watch, Lamau. Anyways, it's interesting that the explanation is that Noah chucked the blade, it returned to origin. Now that I think on it, that does make a degree of sense. The Iris system shares much in common with the Blade system as we see in Origin. Origin is filled with core crystals. These core crystals then are most likely the Origin database of souls, given that they are positioned next to the amphitheater, therefore taking the role as the audience in the final battle. From there, we come to understand that the basis for many of Aionios' mysteries and discrepancies with the prior systems of the world. As everyone is now stored in core crystals, it then follows that there is functionally no difference at this point between the line of driver and blade. Blades and drivers now exist as functionally the same thing, with Origin serving as the core of this system. With that in mind, it's most likely the case that Origin allows these weapons to manifest from the ether, and then, when not in use, likely return to the form of data within the Origin database. We do know that blades have a particular relationship with ether, and they are necessary for the extraction of life essence, in conjunction with the flame clock system. I don't think it's a stretch to insinuate that they, too, are ether manifestations, and this can then be used to retroactively understood sword toss. The blade, if I'm correct, returned to Origin by means of its corresponding Origin database location and the Iris system, and Takahashi's comment seems to support this interpretation. This could also explain how the sword was incorporated into the blade system at all. As we understand, a select number of people are incapable of blade manifestation, and this is likely a result of glitches in the system. It would follow that integrating the Sword of Origin with the sheath, which was already a part of the blade system as evidenced by the Fists of the End, would likely result in the Sword of Origin's ability to return to a data form. As is, Lucky 7 isn't particularly different from other non-Iris system weapons, but it's forged of Origin metal. It then makes a degree of sense that it can be retrofitted for this setup. I do think that this sort of insinuation by Takahashi, how he's effectively communicating goodbye and thanks for everything, at least to me, can be read as a sort of deconfirmation of any sort of familial ties that people have speculated on Noah having to the Xenoblade 1 cast. If he was related to them, I do think that on a meta level, he'd have held on to the blade, as it would be symbolic of his reunion with his family moments ahead of Aionios' collapse. Given that it's a goodbye, and possibly a goodbye for good if we assume that he has no meaningful connection to the cast of Xenoblade 1, and given that Noah is effectively borrowing the power and talent of prior heroes, this sort of indicates that it's not something that would normally be his birthright. If this power isn't something that is his birthright, then he really and truly is just a nobody. Noah being a nobody falls in line with the theme of the Xenoblade main characters. Their tendency is to be people who come from nothing, but out of that nothing have a tremendous impact on the world. Shulk was just a guy. He wasn't the chosen one. He was just a person who was good enough to swing a sword. Rex isn't the chosen one either. He was just a young boy who had a good head on his shoulders and a heart of gold. And that was enough to stem the tide in all rest. The same can be argued for Laura and Torn of the Golden Country, and Matthew in Future Redeemed. Xenoblade doesn't typically hone in on particularly special people. They're normal people, pushed into extraordinary circumstances, who then achieve extraordinary things that change the course of their world's histories. Melia in Future Connected is the sole exception, given her royal status, but even she is notably grounded due to her status as a child of the second consort and the insane journey she was forced to go on to be humbled. As a result of all of this, I have been since day one against the notion of Noah being a special person. He shouldn't be. Noah should just be Noah, and Noah was special enough as himself, as one who saw through the system of violence in the world, becoming the one who would pose and eventually overcome the flow. Next comment. Speaking about the people of the city, he has this to say. After that, it's time to say farewell. It's split between Keves, the people of Bionis, the Agnians, the people of Allrest, and in another corner, there's the people of the city, and those three make up the structure. But I saw quite a number of comments in the survey asking about what happened to the people in the city. So, to answer this, and this is something that I believe you can also understand from the information given in the story, but the people of the city, they're a life that doesn't exist in the original two worlds, and yet they still exist. Despite the origin being something like a memory machine that collected data from both worlds, this is in fact a suggestion that the two worlds will become one, and that these people will absolutely be born in the future. That's the structure, yes. Gondor, Monica, they will be born in the new world. It's funny that this was mentioned a lot of times in the survey. This was also in my survey project too, Lamau. I mean, it makes sense to ask. This was a very question-worthy part of the story. The ending was something you were basically invited to interpret in large part. Future Redeemed made it clear what happened, though. The city people question is emblematic of the entire communal discord with Xenoblade 3. Xenoblade 3 is very different from the prior Xeno games, as the game shifted from the explicit storytelling style of basically every prior entry to an implicit style, where the game invites interpretation and various theories one way or another. Again, literalist versus thematic. Tetsuya Takahashi spoke of this in the Ask the Developer Nintendo interview, that he started from a different point this time around, and had to retroactively incorporate a sense of Xenoblade-ness into the story. Xenoblade 3 was made to be different, on purpose, but this created tension because this was a series, and fandom used to stories that were told in an explicit style. Now we got a game that is basically just one gigantic media literacy check, whereas before we were basically told how to feel, and most minor elements of how the story worked. It put some people off, and that's why Xenoblade 3 is left with an unfortunately complicated legacy. I leaned into the thematic interpretation, so much as I always said that Xenoblade 3 presented enough subtextual evidence for the people of the city's fates. They were destroyed along with Aionios' end, but because of Origin, and because of the world's reunification as seen in the End of Future Redeemed, the people will reunite, and the relationships and bloodline scene will play out again. People like Matthew, and then later generations like Gondor, will be born again, in a world without Mobius, and without war. And this is exactly what Alvis promised at the end of Xenoblade 1. A world where all people would walk towards the future, hand in hand. As Bionis is a component of Earth, and Alris was the other part, and meant that the promise that they made had to be tested. That test was Aionios, and the city was the proof needed to show that the world would meet the expectation that was set forth. I had no doubt at any point that this was the case, and I'm glad now that this is made clear for all to see. Some people have spoken about Tetsuya Takahashi calmly saying that this is a reading, listening, media literacy check, and that he had effectively called people out here. I don't really think that's the case. I would have expected more frustration in that scenario. But, how do I say this? I would have expected something different. This was presented as is. This also ties into something that I feel the need to discuss. I think we see more drama between the two ends of Xenoblade 3's interpretation spectrum. This is not going to support your side by using creator comments to sling crap either way. The people who don't like Xenoblade 3 aren't going to suddenly wake up and like it by being told that they were wrong. And the answers that they rejected from the other side of the community that they already don't like, or outright rejected as explanations, were then all the case. Similarly, whining about lore answers you don't like isn't going to make your dislike of the game any more likely to spread among people who do like the game. The community is unfortunately at a sort of impasse here, and it needs to decide how it is that it's going to move forward, because if one thing is clear from this whole interview, it's that Xenoblade 4 is most likely going to happen, and it will connect to prior events, and it will play off of the information that is provided here. We need to decide how it is that we're going to think, and how we're going to feel as a collective going into the future. Takahashi says that through the lens of Friedrich Nietzsche, Noah as a character can be understood to be the Übermensch that rejects nihilism. This is another awesome thing to hear. I like it when we hear philosophy just explicitly mentioned for the Xeno series. If I'm not mistaken, it's very, very rare nowadays for the Xeno series to wear its inspiration on its sleeve like this. I'm reminded right now of when I played Xenosaga 1 for the first time back in 2014. After I got into the series via Blade 1, of course. And then I saw the database, how it very explicitly listed real-world source and interpretations of the information, and how these story elements named after certain real things were then put together. I kind of really wish that Xeno would do that again, and I'm really, really glad that Tetsuya Takahashi is explicit here for this situation, showing that he has never really lost sight of that deep, philosophical interpretation of his world and his characters and his story and how they spin out. I know that it's not likely to be allowed anymore due to Nintendo's oversight, but it's really cool when you get this. And I guess that's all I really have to say on this one. On the subject of Riku, he says, Riku, he's sly. He's doing all these things while completely understanding everything that's going on. When he says in the city, meh, meh, there's something tiny and cute over there, he's saying that on purpose to bring attention to it, saying, hey, look over there, there's a really tiny person, and look, it's different from you guys, and getting an emotional response out of them. I suppose he's a bit two-faced, isn't he? His master pawn is Melia, so Melia has entrusted him with what is basically Fiora, and of course, he is also one of Riku's sons. Yes, speaking about Riku's explanation about the Lucky Seven and its grandiose origins, specifically about the line 7 legendary swordsmith pawns over the course of 7 years, forged from 7 types of steel, Takahashi says those were convenient lies that Riku made up. I'm just gonna say it at this point. I think that Riku reminds me a lot of Satan from Xenogears. The dude who just knows everything. From beginning to middle to end. A seeming genius of many talents. Who is far more involved with the world and what is going on than he'd ever willingly allow you to know. All while being a stand-in for a sort of father for the hero that desperately needs one. I doubt that Satan was the inspiration, but I'd really like to believe it myself. My partner was Team Kino for Riku's parents on account of the fact that his shade of fur is completely different from Riki's. Takahashi doesn't specify whether Riku was one of the children that we actually saw in Xenoblade 1, or if he's one that was born later, or if he's adopted. I guess it could also be that Nopon fur changes color as they age, maybe? There are multiple potential explanations for his fur color, so I'm not particularly worried about it. But yeah, the debate's settled. It's pretty much what we assumed. There were only 2 real options, Riku or Kino after Future Redeemed. I know many people raged on and debated this particular topic, but I was team he's related to the Xenoblade 1 cast even before Future Redeemed. Implicit storytelling led us to believe that he was connected to Melia, and by extension, would have known the Xenoblade 1 characters. Therefore, the logical conclusion was that he was one of the children of our Nopon companions. And this is yet another victory for people who read between the lines. The story of how he ended up with the Sword of the Origin is probably tied to Aionios' earliest cycles. Melia was captured prior to Future Redeemed, which was at least 150 or so years in, based on what I've managed to research. I really do think there's room for more stories to be told in these very early days of Aionios. Xenoblade Warriors agenda pushing, everybody. I remain firm. I believe it will happen. Just like the Mithrakid story. The Swordsmith's story being a lie is interesting, but I guess it was an easy way of explaining the blade's power to the kids without bombarding them with information that was neither relevant to them at the time, nor would mean anything specifically. All Noah needed to know prior to the eclipse was that the sword was extremely powerful, and that it was special in some way. Another interesting thing to interpret from this is that it was Melia specifically that entrusted him with what was Fiora. This suggests that the friendship that we see between Melia and Fiora has developed a lot deeper than we see on screen even. We knew that they were friendly, we knew that they were well connected, but... Look, man, I'm not pushing the Melia x Fiora ship, but hey, if you want to run with that after this, be my guest. I mean, what the hell? Polygamy is already more than fair based on what we see in this series, but nah. They're probably just great friends. History said they were great friends. Alright. On the Nopon, he has this to say. In this world, the world of Aionios, Nopon are external entities, residing outside of the flow. They don't have a lifespan. They live forever. Me and my friend, Dive, we theorized prior to the release of Future Redeemed that XE1 and 2 characters that existed in Aionios were outside of chronal sync. To explain what that means, think Samurai Jack Season 5, where 50 years had passed, but Jack just didn't age a day, because his atoms were out of their correct place in space-time. Now, we understand that isn't necessarily the case, but it seems like the most basic principle applies here. The world is frozen, and if you're outside of the flow, you do not age. This implies that it was humanity, for sure, and not the Nopon who wish for the endless now. Therefore, the Mobius wish does not apply to them, hence their agreement to stay out of the way of Mobius and its endless conflict. This might also inform the compact mentioned by Shulk, as Shulk and Rex are themselves likely ageless in the context of Aionios as well. Their business was more so with Alpha than Mobius, hence the agreement for neutrality for the time being. It's within Z's best interest to stay out of hot water with people who don't age, who isn't explicitly aligned with him. It was needed for his plans to get one of the queens, but beyond that, people who don't age represent an existential threat to the Endless Now, so it's best to steer clear for him when they're able to. I mean, think about it this way. If I have unlimited time to plan your destruction, and you have unlimited time to plan your defense, we're at a rock and a hard place here, aren't we? On to the next comment. Speaking on that subject, Kojima notes that some survey responders asked about why Shulk and Rex have lived for such a long time, to which Takahashi responds, Shulk and Rex haven't lived long, have they? Origin is only a recreation of the worlds that used to exist, and if you think of them as being emulated, they should only be able to live for what their lifespan is. Shulk and Rex, they defeat Alpha some years after arriving in Aionios, and then they shift to sustaining the world. After that, how should I say this? Their rank. Their rank is the same as Alvis and the rest of the Trinity processor, and this is also true for Melia, Nia, and Fiora, who possessed Mainet's Monado. In other words, if the admin handles it, anything can be done. If the source code of that world is written as a recreation of reality, then if, for example, the lifespan was set to 80 years, when they say they can give their lifespans to Glimmer and Nickel, they can, if they rewrite the code. But you normally wouldn't do that, because you don't know the kind of glitches that are going to occur. In response, A says, this is against the rules. And that's the sort of the idea that is had there. Again, this makes sense that a lot of people talked about this. It's a fair question to ask. I think that this isn't so much of a reading comprehension one, so much as it is a question about observation. That being how long Aionios actually lasted. We were operating without a full deck here, so to say, we didn't understand that Shulk and Rex didn't manifest alongside my Aionios at the same time. So, Shulk and Rex seemingly entered the picture at or around the time that Alpha did, huh? I mean, that makes sense, I suppose. Trinity Processor business is their business, so Alpha appearing because they hate what Z was doing, and then them subsequently appearing, that recontextualizes the shape of the opening of Future Redeemed. That probably was the exact moment that Alpha, Shulk, and Rex all appeared in the flesh in Aionios. This then probably explains Z's declaration of Alpha as my god, as Ontos was the basis for Origin, and as such, the basis for his own existence. More reinforcement of the world's nature as being a sort of recreation, Shulk and Rex then being emulations of the true Shulk and Rex. So, if I'm following this right, it means that Shulk and Rex respectfully most likely had, air quotes, real counterparts existing on both Bionist and Allrest that were, like the rest of the world, trapped in perpetuity. So their Aionios counterparts then are based on the memories, ideas, and concepts that make up the idea of Shulk and Rex, extracted from their corresponding origin data. Their rank makes perfect sense if we observe the world as existing in trinities, which is actually something that I have decided that I am going to make an entire video digging into. Suffice to say, it makes perfect sense for Shulk, Rex, and Fiora to exist on a higher rank, but the real surprise here is the idea that Melia and Nia also exist on that sort of level. I suppose that it was hinted that Nia was operating on some higher degree of power, given that she had the Anima Swords, or rather, the Aegis Blades, manifested just for her. Given that Pyra and Mithra became the Blades of Rex, and then later a family, it makes a degree of sense that Nia would be adequate with fighting with Pyra and Mithra, possibly on her own. Melia, then, is the real question. She was the representative of the world of Xenoblade 1, and she had a key to Origin. Like Nia, mayhap this key might involve some sort of elevation and power and status, maybe even to the level of a Trinity processor. This would serve to explain why it was needed for Mobius to kidnap one of the queens in order to gain elevated permissions to the world. Another interpretation might be that she did contribute to the forging of the third Monado, and subsequently Zanz's death. That might have seen everyone present undergo a sort of ascension in hierarchy. Just food for thought. Next quote. About golden motes, he has this to say. Golden motes, that's ascension. No, in the context of death. Yeah, dissipation, and it turns to a form that is difficult, no, impossible, for Z and the Mobius to use, disappearing to the outside of their systems, without being used by the Mobius. Alright, finally, clarification on the color of the motes. I think that we were able to largely put this together since the game came out, but some people were still very confused on what they were and what their individual significance was meant to indicate. I think the art book speaks on the other colors, but that isn't part of Xenomira's translations, so I cannot confidently comment on that in good faith. That's just what I had read, though, from the bad Google Translate app. We might get more information later. So Z cannot use the ether that exits the system via homecoming. That was clear, I suppose. Again, we were able to largely put that together. There are alternative explanations of why it is they allow people to undergo this process, but I think it's probably a mixture of it being the people's will, which is then taken in by the Mobius wish, and also a practicality standpoint. Golden rank colonies are wiped out, both for the fun of Mobius and to eliminate the possible threat that their power would represent to the system. It would also then follow that people capable of surviving all 10 years are among the strongest warriors in all of Aionios. As we understand it, only 1,000 homecoming ceremonies have occurred in Agnes. In at least 1,200 years that I've managed to count on my own timeline, people capable of surviving the nightmare for that long are certain to contain an awesome level of strength, likely on the level or possibly even exceeding that of the main characters and villains of past entries in the series. In essence, they're just too dangerous to keep in the system. If Noah, Mio, Glimmer, Nicole, Ethel, and Kamaravi are the benchmark against which we're supposed to judge the strength of people capable of lasting all the way to their final term, then it's suffice to say that getting them out of the cycle is extremely important. Them escaping and siding with the city against Mobius is an extreme risk to every member of Mobius. This is also the reason for the borderline religious scale programming, which is necessary to incentivize most people to willingly stay on track. If they believe the dogma, and they do get to be a winner for one cycle, as Z puts it in the end of the game, then they're taken out of the cycle. And if, for example, they get really, really close, like, for example, Chris, then the alternative approach of taking them into the fold of Mobius is another option to take into consideration. Either way, people get to experience victory eventually, and Mobius' dominion over reality is left as unchallenged as possible. Next comment. Takahashi says the hooded boy at the start of Chapter 6 is part of the N that resides deep within Noah's psyche. This is another one of those, why is this a question, questions, but I do think it's important to at least touch on, because it ties into how we understand the relationship between N and Noah as well as M and Neo. The end of the game asserts that they are fundamentally the exact same people, which explains how it was that N and Noah reunited. They were, in essence, the same. Parts of N still exist within Noah, which is what N proved in the eclipse when he broke Noah so sufficiently during the sideshow that he was willing to choose the endless now, if even for a single moment. This proves that N's darkness is still a component of Noah, and that it's not even needed for them to reunify for that darkness to still persist in some respects. This then goes into the importance of the Noah Ascension Quest, in which Noah redeems himself of his failure in the eclipse. That darkness needed to be exercised in order for Noah to become the one who would end the Endless Now. He needed to let go of Chris, where he failed to let go of Mio during the eclipse. Next comment. Takahashi's final comment to wrap up the interview. Xenoblade was released in 2010, and some of our customers have been with us all throughout those 14 years, continuing to follow us, and that makes me deeply emotional. The only thing I have to say is, thank you. We would like to continue to meet the expectations of those who have supported us in that way. With up to Xenoblade 3 finished, I'm sure there's plenty of customers who feel that this isn't enough, that they want to know this or that, and that this book isn't enough to cover that. But we have heard those voices from our customers loud and clear. Gradually, I suppose, or in the future, during the creation process, we would like to respond to those voices. So please look forward to it. That would be it. Yes. And thank you, Takahashi, for your absolutely insane world of wonderful characters and larger-than-life epic struggles against the forces of darkness. I have followed you for much of that time, but I also know that you're even more grateful than you lead on. Given your shout of acknowledgement with the radio to the prior Xeno games, there are some people who have been here since Gears, and in my mind, they're the true heroes in this equation, I'd say. I'm a poser in comparison to someone like that. We're approaching the 15th anniversary of the Blade sub-series soon. Xenoblade, with 4 main games, is now the biggest of the sub-series in terms of title count, and obviously the most well-known and successful of the bunch. It's really amazing that Takahashi made it work after all this time. He envisioned Gears as a 6-episode epic all those years ago, and he effectively got his wish. If you count the numbered Blade trilogy, plus their expansions, it's been an insanely wild ride that I'll patiently wait to see how it goes in the future. The story of the experiment may be over, but the story of Xenoblade has much left to go. I'm sure it speaks to the quality, however, of Future Redeemed, that if the choice was made for that to be the final game, I would accept that decision. That's how immensely satisfying that finale was to me. It was a high like few other that I've ever experienced. I'm glad to hear that the future will entail answering some of these lingering threads. It will be interesting to see how it all pans out. I'm sure that there will be still debate and probably and two interpretation of the work still. But if there's plans, then I'm there, without a doubt. And it's probably good to clarify this now so that people don't fight, and so that we have a good enough understanding of what's coming in the future. And I know you're not reading this, because you really couldn't be, but Takahashi, please don't feel obligated to change direction out of fear of potential misunderstanding. I firmly assert that Xenoblade 3 is the most beautiful work that has come out of Xeno. It was because the team made that game boldly, and they charged forward in on a vision that they all clearly believed in. Along the way, we've lost some people that just didn't get it, but I think for those that did, Xenoblade 3 represents something profoundly beautiful in the grand scheme of not only just Blade, but all of Xeno. When the credits rolled and I heard Joanne Hogg's beautiful voice paired with the epic saga being recapped, all while Saga and Gears and X still managed to be there in spirit, it was a moment that I'll hold close to my heart forever. Follow your dreams, Monolith Soft. I'll be there to follow you in the pursuit of that vision every step of the way. And when the day comes for Takahashi and his peer to put down the pen, for Xenoblade to become not but a memory, it is something that I will hold close for the rest of my days. Thank you, Takahashi. Thank you, Monolith Soft, for this absurd, insane, wild, beautiful, one-of-a-kind game. For this truly profound series. It changed my life forever. I mean that in no exaggerated sense. I eagerly await whatever you will have to show in the future, be it Blade 4, Xenoblade X Remastered, or whatever other title that you might be cooking. I'm there. 0 questions asked. You've earned that much at least. What an interview. What a discussion. I think that this pretty much answered everything that I had to say. Also, some people are pointing out that the art book mentions something pertaining to A's gender. I'm not trans, so that's not my place to comment on that, but I will talk to people and see how they feel about it, just to illuminate my own perspective on that. As for other future content that you can expect on the channel, next up is the end analysis video that I've been cooking for a long time. Around the start of the new year, I finished the script for it, but the thing is that I had to start waiting when they announced the art book, just on the off chance that they announced new lore and information that could tie into what we have to say. And it turns out that I was completely right. I was completely right. Everything that I predicted turned out to be correct, which means that the analysis will be even more reinforced and true. So I'm gonna say look forward to that. For now, I'm gonna get off the call and start editing because my throat is sore. See y'all guys in the next episode. Bye bye.